Okay, so I'm going to talk for a few minutes about building decarbonization. I know some of you came to our public workshop at the Energy Commission a few weeks ago on this topic, so you'll recognize several of these slides. So I'm just going to jump in. Next, please. So this picture of California's greenhouse gas emissions is different from the one that is produced by the California Air Resources Board. This is a combination of the residential and commercial building electricity use and the fossil fuel use in residential and commercial buildings. And that's what ends up being, about a quarter of the pie of emissions in the state. So it's significant that we're focusing on this, and happy to hear that you guys are having a good, solid time up there to talk about this. Next. So this is a screen capture from the ARDS GHG Trends report. They just published it earlier this year. So this kind of tells the story of how we've been doing on emission reductions since we set our AB 32 targets. You can see if you look at the electricity sector, the red triangles, second from the top, we're really doing a good job decarbonizing the electricity sector, which is great news. And one reason that we're talking about building decarbonization or building electrification is because we've been decarbonizing that power supply. And if you look just further down in the commercial and residential, and I guess it's kind of orange, smaller triangles, that's largely natural gas use in residential and commercial buildings. And as you can see, it really hasn't changed in more than a decade. We've kind of flatlined, and no, that doesn't mean that we haven't done anything in that sector. It means that any efficiency gains that we've made has been offset by demand growth in natural gas use in buildings. But we're not getting to the large reductions we need to meet our AB 32 goals by continuing to use natural gas in buildings. And so this is just starting to tell the story of, we've set really aggressive policies for the electricity sector. We have 50% renewables by 2030, I think. And, legislation that gets proposed every year to bump up that number to 100% by 2050. Now that hasn't passed yet, but it's likely to in the future. And it doesn't make sense if you think about it that if we're doing all of that good policy work on the electricity side, that we would continue to use natural gas in buildings. And so it's just logical to think about opportunities to use that low carbon electricity fuel now for building energy use. Next slide. So there's obviously other reasons that all of you have already know probably, and have been discussing in terms of issues using fossil fuels in buildings. Besides the direct emissions, which I've already showed you, fossil fuels produce nasty pollutants, and that leads to high levels of ozone in the vast majority of where Californians live in the state. The other issue that I should have mentioned here is that using combustion inside buildings has indoor air quality issues. It needs special ventilation, and that ventilation needs to work properly. And indoor air quality reports really indicate that there are real health issues by continuing to have combustion happen inside the building, the built environment. Next slide. So the next couple slides are just to kind of understand the landscape of natural gas use in California, because if we want to do something about it, we need to know as much as possible about what we're doing in terms of using gas in buildings in the state. So this first pie on the left is all of the energy used in California buildings, both electricity and natural gas, residential and commercial. So the blue is electricity use and the red is natural gas use. It's pretty much 50-50. But the biggest quartile in that sphere is residential gas use. So I'm on the phone. So just focusing now on that residential gas use, that is the biggest piece of the pie. It's pretty much, if you go to the pie, then on the left, you're looking at largely water heating and space heating, contributing the vast majority of that, and then cooking and clothes drying and other uses filling out the rest of the pie. So when we think about decarbonizing buildings, as you know, and as you've been working on, we're largely talking about space heating and water heating. But for residential, cooking is probably also what you've been talking about. Cooking is not a big energy use, but it has some market transformation issues, right? Because you have to convince people that they want to cook with electricity, and I know we've all been talking about that. The next slide, if you could move to the next slide, is just to round off the rest of the gas use in buildings, and that's commercial buildings. And here, basically the difference is cooking is now as important as water heating and space heating in terms of replacing that fuel use with electricity alternatives. Cooking is a huge area to focus on in commercial buildings. Next.
Martha, can you hear me?
Yeah.
With the previous slide, what did the percentages refer to? Like 87% of buildings have natural gas? Or when you were showing
so no, this isn't the number of buildings. What this is if you look at site energy of buildings, so in other words, you take that 90% water heating, that means 10% they're using electricity. So 10% of the site energy. So these huge numbers means of all the fuel use happening in buildings, 90% is gas for water heating, 89% is gas for space heating, etc.
Energy use.
So it's not the same as number.
Thank you, that's clarified.
Okay. So next. So this is the first view we have of the electric. These are the slides that we presented at the decarbonization workshop. This is really another really important illustration of both the opportunity and the issues we have with decarbonization. So if you look, this is two separate charts of the average hourly emission intensity of California's electricity grid. In 2019, there's some really low numbers in the middle of the day, in the spring and going into the summer, and but that's it. In most of the rest of the time of the year, when you're largely using natural gas to generate electricity, you still have relatively high emission intensities. If we meet our renewable portfolio standard in 2030, then the grid becomes much more renewable, and there are many more hours in the day and the months across the year where the emission intensity is much lower. So this is the, yes.
There's a question from Jim as to what was the difference between June and July? You can see that's a significant change in that June-July moment. It's wise. Oh,
It's probably the drop off of hydropower too.
So it is, I would agree with that. That is largely the drop off of hydropower. And what else? That's probably it. That's probably about it. Remember, these are these are average. They're not marginal, and that's the other thing I'll just make a slight note of, and you'll see it if you read our decarbonization policy report. We're hoping to regenerate these charts and the numbers that are behind them for the marginal emission intensity. So that means that if we're going to do big policy changes, what we really want to make our decisions on is how do those big policy changes impact the resources that need to supply electricity. So it's not exactly the same as this, but I personally don't know how different it's going to be. So it'll be an interesting study. So look for an update of this. Unfortunately, it probably won't be until 2019 that we actually get to show you a different version of this. So for now, this is what we have. Next. So this is a different version of the same data. They're still emission intensities, but they're relative to the emission intensity of natural gas. And so this is really the most important thing from the building's perspective, because if we're making policies about electrification, we need to do it so that we're using energy in the green spaces and not the red spaces, right? And so it really matters. And to my boss, Commissioner McAllister, that when you use electricity is always been important, and it's even more important if you're trying to decarbonize. And so this is the view in 2019. And if you go to the next slide, please. This is a view in 2030. So this picture right here is really what drives our policy decisions about decarbonization, because you can see that the majority of time, it's a good decision to use electricity, even if it's on the grid and not getting generated renewably on your site. Even if you're using grid electricity in 2030, most of the time, it's going to be a better choice than natural gas. Next slide. So just to summarize those last two slides, from the building's perspective, using electricity will be cleaner than natural gas 70% of the time in 2030, but only 40% of the time right now. And so that's really important for you guys that are planning, and implementing, building level, energy systems. It's not a slam dunk right now that you're saving carbon by electrifying. It's still more than half of the time in terms of hours of the year. It's not the right decision, right? And so, but again, that's looking at the grid, not looking at your building with renewables on site. But then again, if you have a renewable on site, but you don't have a battery or another way to store that clean electricity, then you really need to think about this carefully. And I know that you're going to have Scott Shell, if you haven't already, talk about how he's using this information to plan his buildings.
So a couple of questions for you. Obadiah.
So my question is, can you confirm that that's equivalent of like a resistance heater and not taking into account the efficiencies of heat pumps?
So the question was.
I got it.
Okay.
Yeah. So right now we haven't talked at all about efficiency. This is just what the energy systems look like, right? So we're going to get there, Obadiah, in a couple more slides. Talk about that. It's a very good question, right? Because of this 40% now, you have to have significant gains in efficiency to make that electrification a smart idea, right? And so we're going to get there, but that's a good question.
And
next, go ahead.
Hi, Martha. So I guess that's in today's efficiencies, but over the life of the building, where's that? If the building has a 30-year life in 2030, 70% of the time, so but we're building buildings today like, is it neutral over the life of the building? You know, better than 50% of the homes are better over the life of the building, rather than just looking at today's 40% or better?
No, absolutely. I personally think we're planning for the 70% or better, right? Because you're right, buildings have long lives. I think that the point of this is that, well, to Obadiah's point, it's not electrification, it's smart electrification, right? So you gotta, do as much as possible on the efficiency front, and then you're gonna need, we're talking about, and Wassie's gonna talk about thermal and battery storage. And so again, when you use that electricity is the other part, right? So, and I'm gonna get to that in terms of where we're gonna focus the building standards and existing building policies in the future.
This morning we had two presentations, one from Mark Fisher of LVL, one from Naomi Wentworth of UC San Diego on gas and methane leakage. Does this graph have any leakage assumed in it?
It has no leakage assumed in it. It's just the carbon. It's just so that's a good point. Those slides, and I'll be sure to do that next time I do this talk, is those are carbon intensities, not emission intensities, because they don't include methane. And that's an interesting challenge, right? It's not, we have to do that part carefully too, because that methane leakage is going to happen for the gas power plant also, as well as buildings. And so it's not just that you can jack up the natural gas in buildings emissions, you also have to account for it on the electricity side, because there's still a large percentage of hours where electricity is coming from natural gas power plants. So I think that's a stay tuned, but let's keep talking about it and working on it. Absolutely. I'm on slide 11 now, California policy direction, building standards. Okay, so Mozzie's going to go into this much more, but I get to talk about it first, so there you go. So, and you the advocates in the room, which I think is probably, I'm guessing 95% of you, you've been asking for us to do this for quite a while, and so we're transitioning to this for the future, and that is that we're going to adopt an energy metric for building standards that aligns with emission reductions. Oh my gosh. Okay, so there you go. So, and that's applied to all fuel types, right? Which is appropriate. And now the next thing is that, again, because of the smart electrification and paying attention to the hours that you're using electricity, we're still going to keep the good part of TDD. And in my opinion, the good part of TDD is that hourly demand flexibility component. So for electricity, once you electrify, right, then it's all about how you use electricity. And so we don't want to lose that piece. We just want to add it in after we've done the first part. Okay, so adopt a secondary metric for demand flexibility. And hopefully you guys think that's a good thing. And then finally, this is my personal pitch, so I hope I can help get this accomplished before I retire, is the other part of climate change is resiliency. And so we can't forget about the building envelope. And right now in Title 24, we don't care if it's a piece of insulation or if it's a piece of ductwork for equipment performance. Everything's equal in the trade-off approach. Even though the building envelope is going to last twice as long as equipment, and energy units traded equally across those two. And I think it's time for us to change that and really protect the building envelope in the trade-off approach. And we can do that. We don't need any special, blessing from the governor or the legislature. We can do that within our own authority right now. So, okay, next. So this is just an example of why we need to move to a different metric. So this is the 2019 residential building code, looking at, on the top is Sacramento, on the bottom is Los Angeles. On the left is our mixed fuel home, and on the right is an all electric home. And this is Obadiah's point. This is Obadiah's point, because the difference in water heating between the left and the right, is both 3 times more efficient electric water heating, and also the emission intensity reduction, moving from left to right. But space heating, there's no efficiency improvement. So if you look at the blue in the corners, that's smaller, but it's still there on the all electric side. Our standard now for our space heating has the same efficiency between the mixed fuel, a gas furnace, and a heat pump. But our water heating efficiency is 3 times higher for electric than it is for gas. The other thing I'll say about this slide is, once you electrify, it's super important to pay attention to refrigerant leakage, because it's the largest remaining emission source after you electrify the building. Next.
Martha?
Yes.
But this slide also doesn't include gas leaks, correct?
No.
No,
But it does include refrigerant.
it does, because one's happening right there at the building site, and the other reason is that we have some solid information from ARB on that, and we're still in the you know, I guess we're not in the, we don't have the same level of policy commitment and you know, information adoption on the leakage side in terms of painting that picture. I absolutely think we need to do that and focus on it, but I didn't have the information in front of me that I could include that in these slides. So, but you should know it does not include any leakage of methane.
On your 25, you got about 5 minutes left.
No, it's perfect. I got 2 more slides. All right, next. Now for existing buildings, which is the most important thing in terms of statewide emission reductions. The very first thing that we're going to do when we update our policy report on doubling energy efficiency, which includes fuel substitution, is develop significantly larger targets for savings for cost-effective fuel substitution. We didn't do much in the first version of SB 350 on this, and we need to make a much bigger savings target and communicate its cost effectiveness. The other thing that we're starting to work on now at the Energy Commission is the market transformation for heat pump water heaters. And I know several of you guys are working on this too, and we hope to partner with you on this. We think we're super excited about opportunities here. So we need replacement products. And we need those products on the plumber's truck when the water heaters break down, their emergency replacements. We need plumber education and training, and public awareness, and ratepayer incentives, and potentially really effective up and midstream incentives, so the consumer doesn't know why the heat pump water heater is affordable. It's just affordable, and the product gets installed. Next. So I actually think that water heating is the easier of the two. I think it's going to be harder to find really effective space heating alternatives, and that's because we haven't, our experience is that the high the heat pump space heaters that are rated really high on the EAR and SEER scale don't perform that way in real life field installations. And so we really want to push the adoption of, you know, really high quality specifications and test procedures so that we can incorporate those in our standards and in our incentive programs and really get, again, that 3x bump in efficiency that we need to really shrink the emissions from space heating. So we're looking at, we have been looking at, and we'll continue to look at the very successful Northeast Efficiency Partnerships cold climate heat pump spec. And we're also working with PG&E and others on the Canadian Standard Association's variable capacity heat pump test procedures. And it's very likely that we could basically say, if you give us the data from your test of your mini split heat pump, say, and it's a full performance curve worth of information, we can incorporate that into our modeling of our code compliance modeling and get you full credit for that performance across the full bandwidth of capacity. And that should help the manufacturers want to market these products in California, because they'll be given the credit that they're due, but we won't be having the issues that we think we're having now with trade-offs, again, envelope largely, where the space heaters aren't actually meeting the spec that they've been tested under, or that spec doesn't match field performance. And then finally, what we really need to do, which we can't do alone, is the Energy Commission, and SMUD's an excellent example of, where there's beginning to be efforts now on really good and comprehensive incentive programs for decarbonization, and that's a natural and important step for the market transformation.
All right, with that, let's give you a round of applause.